So tonight we're talking about global theology, and our discussion today is people on the move. And so there's been two phenomena that have reshaped the way that Christianity behaves in this world. And so if you think historically, Christianity was very predominant in the West and non-existent in the rest of the world. And then colonialism and other forces took Christianity around the world. And now a lot of those believers are now coming back here. And so this whole migration of peoples has not just been one way from the West to the rest, but now we're kind of entering this third era of the gospel from everywhere to everywhere. And so I want to give you a couple of statistics. Right now, there's about 3% of the world that we would count as an immigrant or someone who's not living in the country that they were born in. 3% doesn't sound like a whole lot until you start figuring out how many people that is. That's 214 million people, which is about the population of Japan. So imagine if the population of Japan was immediately displaced and moved somewhere else, anywhere else. That's a huge global shift. If you took all of I'm going to use the word diaspora to talk about, so that if you think of the word diaspora, it comes from the word disperse. So people have been dispersed throughout the world. So if you take all of the diaspora throughout the world and you put them into one country, that would make the 5th largest country in the world. That's a pretty significant happening. About half of all immigrants move to Europe and North America. So some people are just moving regionally. They might be from China or from Thailand or from Vietnam and just move regionally from one of those areas. They might be moving regionally inside Latin America or even the United States. But many of them, half of them, are coming to Europe and America. And about 1 in 5 of all global immigrants come right here to the United States. We are the #1 destination for immigration throughout the world. And so this is going to reshape it. Now, for those of us here in Houston, we are on the forefront of this, right? So 1 in 4 Houstonians is foreign born. Particularly when you look at the 30 and under crowd in Houston, it gets incredibly diverse. And so this trend is about to really take off kind of exponentially. So here's just to kind of bring this home for us. This is the percentage of population that is foreign born in Houston. This map is about 10 years old. So if you notice, there's a couple of those purple census districts. Those purple census districts are between 70 and 80% foreign born. That dark brown is between 40 and 65% foreign born. And so I didn't put our church on this map, but we are in one of those areas that's about 40 to 65% foreign born. But we're bordering all kinds of areas that have tons and tons of people from everywhere. So this has really impacted the landscape of Houston, where we're not like other cities that have a common shared experience and history and language and religion. We've just got people from everywhere. Let's look at the same thing in terms of language. So this is a map of languages spoken in homes. So not talking about publicly, we're talking about in home. So heart language. And this does not count Spanish or English. Now, if we added Spanish to this list, it would almost become unimportant because they would just the map would be so concentrated. But taking out English and taking out Spanish, these are the other languages spoken in Houston. And so you see those dark purple areas. That's between 40 and 70% of those people speak a language other than English or Spanish in their home. Again, all around our church, very, very heavy percentages of people speaking languages other than English or Spanish. Granted, walk around this community, you're going to find tons of people speaking Spanish. And so you add Spanish speakers into this mix, and it just increases from here. So all of this global immigration, people talk about it on this global scale, and they might be like a professor living in Kansas or something. We don't live in Kansas. We live in Houston, which has kind of become this crossroads throughout the world. So why do people move? There are two things at play. One is push factors, and the other are pull factors. And so things like push factor, this is something that's motivating people to leave. It's pushing them out. Things like natural disasters. You see, earthquake or tsunami in Japan, and people move. Even if they're just internally displaced, they are displaced. Things like a hurricane. We picked up 100,000 people after Hurricane Katrina, of folks who came from New Orleans and are now settled and living here in Houston. Things like limited resources. Maybe you're a child of a farmer and he might have like 10 kids, and so you just can't keep dividing the land more and more and more. And so there's a limitation to how much resources there are. Things like war. We're seeing the largest migration in human history right now because of the conflict that's happening in the Middle East. And so we see with the Syrian refugee crisis putting millions upon millions of refugees that are literally walking out of their country. Outside of that, you see people hopping on boats from North Africa and sailing across the Mediterranean and landing in Greece and landing in Turkey and landing in other places. The same thing is happening in the Far East, in Burma. The Rohingya Muslims there are getting into boats and pushing off. So there's this sense of desperation why you would be pushed out of your country and motivated to leave that way. Things like bad economy or political problems are other factors. Pull is on the opposite side. So some people are coming because there's better job opportunities. People don't live in Houston because of our fantastic weather, though today we actually have really fantastic weather. It'd be kind of nice if we met out on the lawn today, but we're not, so just get over it. But you're here because you can have a really high-paying job and a relatively low cost of living. It's an easy place to balance that out nicely. Better cost of living, that relates also to job markets, educational opportunities, physical safety. And so these are things that will attract you into another place. And so we need to be aware of what kind of immigrant that people are. When people talk about immigrants, a lot of times we just mean refugees. Or politically speaking, when people talk about immigrants, they typically just mean illegals. Or the people who are more conscious of that language will say undocumented. But there's a lot of different kinds. And so we want to throw first out the idea of tourists. Tourists might seem insignificant, but just with like Muslim countries alone, credit card companies are doing massive, massive studies because this is huge business. So when you think of a Muslim tourist looking for a vacation or time away or maybe scouting out business options or whatever, they are looking for amenities such as halal restaurants and mosques nearby. And so credit card companies are putting tons of research in. In 2016, there were 150 million Muslim tourists in that 1 year. So by 2025, there will be more Muslim tourists than the population of the largest Muslim country in the world, which is Indonesia, traveling annually. So not everybody is fleeing conflict. Sometimes people are coming to have a good time. There's a subset of these which are medical tourists. So medical tourists, if you work in the medical center or have visited the medical center for some kind of test or to see a doctor or something, you will notice that however you identify, most of the people in your vicinity are not like you. And so you'll see people from other countries. You see a lot of really wealthy Saudis or Jordanians. So we have close to 100,000 medical tourists every year here in the United States. And we're not the only country benefiting from this. Thailand, there's a huge medical tourism business going on there as well. So they have hundreds of thousands of patients every year. In fact, there's one hospital in Thailand that admitted 120,000 foreign patients in 1 year. That's a lot of people when you think about it. Another category, students. And so students, there's just over 500,000, 690,000 international students here. The largest single group would be Chinese, followed by Indians, Koreans, and then Middle Easterners, most of whom are Saudis. So students make a really big population of international immigrants. Guest workers are another. And then finally, refugees. So there's currently 65 million people in the world today that have been forcibly displaced, that would be categorized as refugees. And so 54% of all of these refugees are from the countries of Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. So basically half of all refugees right now are from those three countries, Somalia, Afghanistan, and Syria. So whatever you think of internationals or immigrants, I hope that this categorization helps you understand there's a lot more nuance to this category. So the benefits that people or the challenges that people might bring with them as they come might be related to why did they get here and what kind of immigrant are they. So if you fled your country because of a war, chances are you didn't come very well prepared, you might not have learned English. If you came here for education or for business, chances are you're probably very highly educated. You've probably spent a lot of time studying English over the course of your life, and you might even come from a fairly affluent family. And so the needs, challenges, considerations for each of these groups is very different. Come on, catch up. There we go. So I want to see what is God's purpose for diaspora? Why does He allow and even cause people to be dispersed throughout the world? And I think the first cause of this is positive. We always look at dispersion as negative, and certainly as we go through the Old Testament, when God tells the Jewish people, hey, if you don't obey, if you do follow idols, I will kick you out of the land that I brought you into. There certainly is a judgment component, but the original command to Adam and Eve was be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And so God's original design for humanity was not that we stacked up in one place and formed a little group and that was it. In fact, you see after the flood, God gives Noah this same command, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. And this is where they all kind of group together and they start building a tower together. And so instead of filling the earth, so God comes down and confuses languages, and then they start spreading out. So the first point is that it's part of a positive command to fill the earth. The second is, it is in fact judgment. Adam and Eve, they're dispersed, they're scattered from the garden because they disobeyed. Cain killed his brother Abel, so God scatters him, he's sent away. The Jews in exile, this is a scattering. And so there is definitely a negative side of this. After the exile, Jews had been scattered throughout the entire world. And so while they were there, they no longer had access to the temple, namely because it had been flattened, and they were no longer in Israel. So they started building synagogues. In the New Testament, it says that in the fullness of time, Christ was born. And so Jesus could have been born at another point in history, but according to God's plan and God's wisdom, he was born at the time in which he was. And I would say that there is a reason. When you look at Acts and you notice what their pattern is, they go to a new city and their first stop in any new city is the synagogue. Well, there would not be this deposit of people who throughout the world already had there not been the dispersion because of judgment. So the judgment was they worshiped idols, they got kicked out. But now they're spread throughout all the world. They've had this time of judgment, of repentance, of healing, of cleansing. And then Paul or some of the other apostles wanders in and says, let me show you who this Messiah is and how Jesus is the Messiah. And they reason with them from the scriptures. And so even something that started as judgment, God later takes and uses for the blessing of the world. That fits in line with this next point, which is global missions. We see that part of this dispersion is happening in the Bible for the sake of God's mission. You can see the church in Antioch, which was the first multi-ethnic church. It was started as a result of the persecution which happened in Jerusalem. So in Jerusalem, Saul and some of the other persecutors come in, start persecuting the Christians, and all of a sudden they scatter. And you read through the next couple chapters and you keep following the names and who was from where and went to where, and you realize that this church in Antioch is formed by people that fled Jerusalem because of persecution. Again, the Great Commission, much like that early covenant of be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, the Great Commission was to the ends of the earth. And where did a lot of the Christians stay? Huddled up, nice and safe and sound in Jerusalem. And so persecution, we would say, is a bad thing, but it helped to accomplish God's purposes. And so we see God's sovereignty is all over, whether it's for good or bad, whether it's judgment or blessing. We see that God's purposes are being fulfilled by sending people throughout the world. And so let's look at one passage in particular that really makes this very, very clear. This is Acts 17, 24 to 27. And so Paul has wandered into Athens, and he's already spoken to the people in the synagogue. And then when he leaves the synagogue, he goes out into the marketplace. And the marketplace, they don't understand what he's saying. Some of them think that he's drunk. Some of them think he's purveying some kind of new religion. And so they bring him up to the Areopagus. And they want to hear more about what he's saying. And so he starts in a very different way than he normally does. And he gives kind of the big picture of what God is doing in the world. And he says, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. So he's telling them, look, I'm not here, like you've got all these temples all around you. I'm not here to just put up one more temple. God doesn't need any of this. Since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God and perhaps feel their way towards him and find him, yet he is actually not far from each one of us. And so in this passage, he's describing this global spread of people, even though it's not nearly on scale as it is today, and he's explaining why this has happened. According to God's sovereignty, according to God's plans, what does it say? He has allotted periods and boundaries. So he has given to different empires, he has allowed them to get established for a period, a time period. And he's allowed them to have some boundaries. So if we think back to that idea of the fullness of time, the Greeks had blessed the Western world with a common language. And so the Romans came and conquered the Greeks, and through this they adapted their language to a lot of their ideas. They even kind of pulled over the Greco-Roman pantheon. They adopted even the religious elements. And then they applied those in their own culture. And what the Romans brought was this massive road system and peace where you could actually travel safely from one city to another. We all remember the story of the Good Samaritan where the guy's traveling down the road and gets beaten up and left for dead. That was much less of a fear in this area, this era of Pax Romana, this era of the peace of Rome, than it was prior to that. And so God has established all of these things so that people will seek God, feel their way towards him, and find him. And so I say with no lack of confidence whatsoever that at no other time in human history have so many people who don't have the knowledge of God lived right next to people who do have the knowledge of God. Now, there's a problem in how we structure our cities. And so you can think historically about our area of Houston in particular. This used to be an affluent suburb of Houston. A lot of white people lived here. As the neighborhood started diversifying, there's this phenomena that's not just happened in Houston, it's happened in most of the major cities in the United States. There's this thing called white flight. And they started heading out further. I was briefly the interim pastor for a church that's a little bit further from here, and they were struggling because, among other things, a lot of their people were leaving to go further out. And I was preaching this passage, and I said, how far do you think you're going to go that God's just going to keep sending them to you, right? We haven't sent our people overseas like we've been commanded to. I think back to Jonah. God told Jonah, go to Nineveh. He goes the exact opposite way. But God had a way to just bring him around to his point of view and to put him where he wanted him. And I think God can do the same thing. And so he goes, fine, y'all don't want to go? I'll bring them to you. Oh, you're going to move out to Katy? All right, go hang out in Katy these days. It's almost as diverse as Alief is now. And so, God is just going to keep sending the people until we wake up and look around at people that are in our business and in our neighborhood and on sports teams with our kids, and we wake up and go, wait a second, not only has God put them here for a certain purpose, God has put me in this office for a certain purpose. He's put me on this sports team. He's put me in this neighborhood for the same purpose, so that the two of us meet. And without having to travel around the world and get visas and learn new languages necessarily, we have access to people from everywhere. I mean, just look around this room right now and think about how many different cultures are right here in this one tiny little group of people inside Houston. And so imagine for a moment if you're in a massive gymnasium and I were to put you in the middle of the gymnasium and turn the lights out. You would start groping. In fact, one Bible translation uses the word grope in this, is that people would grope and find their way towards him. And so you would start, in the dark, kind of feeling your way so you don't run into anything, looking for the light switch. So God has fast-tracked this process through global immigration. He's basically put people who are in darkness right next to the light switch, so you have much farther to reach. This is God's grace. This is his heart, that people should know him, that people should reestablish relationship with him. And so he takes people that are in a massively dark room and he puts them right next to the light switch where they just have to reach and touch like this and they go, oh, there it is. Lights are on. And so God has established all of this so that people would seek him. as we're in another fantastic election cycle right now, you get to hear lots of rhetoric about what should we do with immigrants and what's, our president's plan and what's the alternate plan. And so many times the church gets so sucked into which candidate are we for, which party are we for, that we forget that God's kind of on his own side. I'm reminded of when Joshua was outside of Jericho, and he's thinking through the battle plans, and the angel of the Lord shows up, and he looks at the angel and goes, "Are you on our side or their side? Are you with us or against us?" And he goes, "I'm on God's side. Who are you?" And I think we get so hung up into that. Is God Republican or Democrat? Is he for this plan or that plan? Without realizing that regardless of what we ought to do or ought not to do as a country to fix a problem or not a problem, depending on your politics, there is something that we as God's people should be doing. And we've talked about hospitality so many times through the course of this class, but that need to welcome people into our cities, to see them not just as some random stranger, some straggler, but to see this as God has actually put them here on purpose. And God has put me here on purpose. We always think, man, I'm going to serve God, so I'm going to quit everything I'm doing. I'm going to go move over to this other place, and I'm going to start all this other activity without realizing right where you're at, wherever that is where God has put you. Not to say he's not going to move you, not to say he's not calling you somewhere else or some other change, but at least in that initial phase, you are exactly where God has placed you for a time. And what we need to do is live with that kingdom purpose regardless of where we are. So I want to talk very quickly about diaspora missiology. So we're talking about what is a mission strategy or mission philosophy to people that have been dispersed. And so the people who are helping develop this theory, they like prepositions a lot. And so their first one is to, then they have through, and beyond, and with. And so when they talk about mission to the diaspora, they're talking about kind of in our church context. We are in a community that's very, very international, and we have an opportunity to reach out to people who do not know God. And so this is kind of us to them. Now, our us is very, very diverse, and it includes lots of diaspora people. So this theory doesn't entirely depict what's happening here. Through, though, is when there's now a group of believers inside any given people group, and now they are taking the gospel, they're taking that same message to family and to their friends, and maybe even back home, which gets to beyond, where they start taking the gospel message back home or to other people groups that are around them. And then with is something that you'll hear me talk a lot about, where I start talking about the fact that the world is relationally connected. And so even us as outsiders, whichever group you're outside to, that other group represents a connection of relationships. And so these relationships you can use to get places, whether that's locally or globally. When we think of how to get something done or how to find something, our first response is, well, let's go to Google, let's Google this, and then we'll find an email address or contact info, and we'll send like a cold call kind of thing. And that's our big fear, is like having to call somebody for the first time on the phone and say, hey, I'm Brian, here's what I'm trying to do, blah, 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 blah. But this whole with idea is a much more relational model. So instead of saying, how do I just find the random contact info, send this random email and hope that somebody on the other side answers and responds, it's who do I know that could connect me to this group or to that group? And chances are, again, just look around this room, think of how many countries that we're all connected to. So if I was trying to get to pretty much anywhere, probably within a phone call or two from one of you, we could at least have an initial contact on the ground. And so what an amazing time to think about following God, to think about spreading God's name throughout the world in a time where the world is so globally networked and connected. So people talk about flat earth now. They're using that term to describe there's no longer this massive distance between us and them that has really flattened out to the point that, via a Facebook group or other connections, it's very, very easy to get connected to other people. One thing that people who are from other places struggle with, and even some of us struggle with this, is identity. Who are we? So if we were born somewhere else and then we grew up here, who are we? So I was born in Texas, but I lived overseas in the UK as a kid. And then I came back, and then I went to school in North Carolina, and then I lived in Texas again, and then I moved to the Middle East, and then I came back. But really, like, my family is from Louisiana, And so, like, who am I? Where am I from? As I've bumped into so many different cultures and learned so many different things, I've got, great new ways to solve problems or resolve conflict. But I also don't remember, like, what is my cultural pattern of what I'm supposed to be doing. So one way of forming identity is transnationalism, where people, will hyphenate, where their country is from, or they'll think of themselves still as a citizen of their former country, even though they're living somewhere else. Another one is a hybrid identity, where these two start melding together. Another thing you'll see is generations. So the first generation that comes, they think of themselves as, I'm from whatever the home country is. But the children, they think of themselves as, well, I was born here in America, and English is my predominant language, and my parents' language, I kind of understand it, but I don't really speak it as much. And so they don't think of this as their home language. Again, we're not the only country that's taking in lots of internationals. If you go to UAE, United Arab Emirates, you're in the city of Dubai, thousands, probably millions of Indians are working there. The city is run by Indians and Pakistanis. But they are not allowed to immigrate there. So you have people who are born in the UAE who, when they die, have to be moved back to India, even though that's not at all home. Imagine being born here, growing up here, not having any connection, but realizing it's like my family's French, if you go back far enough. All of a sudden, I have to go back to France to die. Well, I don't speak French. I don't understand French culture, and I don't know where I'm really from in France. I mean, that's such a distant memory for me that I don't think of myself as French. And so as generations happen, the first generation has a strong affinity for the homeland. The second generation, though, might have a very strong affinity for the new land and might think of themselves this way. This creates tension between parents and children. In church settings, you have pretty much any language-based or ethnicity-based church goes through this kind of struggle where the parents' generation typically is they're typically the ones running the show, picking the songs. They do everything in the home language. And then the kids, who are much more familiar with and comfortable with American culture, English language, more American forms of worship, immediately there's this generational split. And so in order to keep attracting people from the homeland, they have to keep that home language. But then the kids wind up wanting to just integrate into other churches. They just want to go to like a random, non-denominational church or like big contemporary church or something like that. They just want to kind of blend into American culture. And so this creates a huge power struggle on the one hand, but just kind of a dissonance within any language-based church as they're trying to sort out. Their children are becoming more American over time. And then next, there's this assimilation mindset of we should just come in. And there's different ways of assimilating. Somebody compared it to 3 different animals here. So one is grasshoppers. People who assimilate like a grasshopper, they just want to blend in. So a lot of times if you're walking through the field, you don't see a grasshopper until you startle it, and then it jumps and flies because they camouflage really, really well. And so a friend of mine in Egypt, he was visiting the United States, and he said, Brian, I'm really worried that they're going to see me and they're going to think that I'm Middle Eastern. And, because of all the politics right now, they're going to be really mad at me. And I said, look, let me teach you a few phrases in Spanish. And you just blend right in. And when he came back, so he's again in Houston, like we have people from everywhere. And so he came back and go, well, how was it? He goes, nobody even knew I was from Egypt. I'm like, yeah, welcome to America. The second one is oysters. So you think of an oyster. Oyster has a hard shell around it. And so these are people who have something on the inside, but then something on the outside that keeps everything out, and everything in. And so if you assimilate like an oyster, essentially you have your own private domain, which is like stepping and being transported into another culture, another time, and another space. And so, but then on the outside, they just smile and they're whoever. But inside the home, it's this taste of the homeland. And so there's no actual assimilation. They just kind of live in this paradoxical experience. And then the third category would be owls. And these are people who, they use owl because there's a sense of, an owl is a wise animal. And so very wisely, they learn how do you navigate between your home culture and maintaining that identity, maintaining some language connection, and then the new culture and integrating here. Does anybody have any questions about global immigration. I realize it's a massive topic to just throw out in 30 minutes.
Going back to where you were talking about how many were in, I don't even know if this is, I could get back there, but you were talking about the three places where we get most of our immigrants. Where does Mexico figure into that? Because many of us, or maybe perceive that a lot of Mexico has come over here.
Yeah, so in terms, are you talking about this slide right here? So in terms of our, like, where do we get the most immigrants from? It is Mexico.
I thought you said Somalia.
That was refugees. Most Mexicans do not come as refugees. Again, we need this kind of distinction to help us understand not every, I mean, if you're watching the news and it's all about the Syrian refugee crisis, there's this lady who's going to move to Houston to help the Pakistanis here. And in her city, all of the Pakistanis were refugees. And so she was setting up an ESL school and a clothes closet and a food pantry. And she started talking to me. She goes, look, I want to do what I'm doing. I think she's in Chicago. I want to do that in Houston. And she started talking to me about her ideas. And on the phone, I said, ma'am, let me stop you right there. The Pakistanis here, they drive Mercedes. They live in, $250,000, $500,000 homes. Which I said, in Chicago, that's probably nothing. I said, but here, that's like a mansion. They are very educated. They're highly professional. I said, I would love to have you in Houston, but they are a different group than the one you're working with. And so again, we need this level of nuance to understand. So our number one group, ethnically speaking, is from Mexico.
And they're not refugees. You hear that so many people are coming because of the violence, the gang, the...
Yeah. So I think those people could probably be classified as a refugee per se. But I would say the majority of Mexicans who come here are coming as this guest worker.
Thank you.
Yeah. So again, this nuance helps us understand whatever our lens for seeing internationals or other people that are not like us through. A lot of times there's many, many, many layers where, a lot of times we think of internationals. I mean, if your experience is internationals are poor, you think, well, all internationals are poor. And then, like in our Indian community here in Houston, you see their weddings. I mean, the Indians can do a wedding. There was one, my brother does photography for weddings, and he gets a lot of Indian clients. And there was one downtown where they rented out the entire Four Seasons. And somehow, I don't know what he had on the mayor, but they had something because they were allowed to close down a city block or two around the hotel so that they could do some massive procession through the streets. And so again, if you think, well, internationals are all poor. No, they've got more money than probably all of us combined right here.
So in that slide, when you say immigrants, some of those are very temporal, right? Mm-hmm. And then some of them are more permanent.
Yes.
But there's no really distinction between those.
There's not distinction on this slide, but I think that is a good nuance to bring in. So Ming was saying that some people are here temporarily. So if you look at students, a lot of times they're here on a 4-year visa or 5-year visa, something like this. And so at the end of the visa, they either have to figure out some different visa or they have to go home. Guest workers probably are more permanent. Medical tourists tend to be just very, very specific, or tourists tend to be very specific time.
We have to consider all of them as immigrants and part of the diaspora.
Yeah. I guess immigrant might not be the best term for some of them. Yeah, the language of this is very difficult, and that's why I use diaspora. I don't like diaspora because nobody knows what it's not a very common word. Immigrant is much more common. At the same time, as you say, if you're not immigrating, can you really be an immigrant? Or you could call them migrant workers, which takes like the idea of staying sort of off the table. So anyway, it's a very, very deep topic when you start getting into it, very contemporary. It deals with many, many, many issues that are impacting our workforce, our education force, our tax policy, our foreign policy with other countries. So if you come from an enemy country of ours, and you land on the beach, you're going to be welcomed with open arms and probably have a very quick track to citizenship. If you're from an allied country and don't follow all the protocol, it's a very quick exit, no matter how knowledgeable and professional you are, and so it's just kind of weird. You know, I mean, if somebody wanted to defect from Russia and come to the United States, I mean, they would just, you know, they'd give them that blue passport really, really quickly. But to try to defect from, I'll just pick on Tony, try to defect from India, good luck, because we actually have a treaty with them, and so that prevents that kind of thing from happening. Anyway, there's a lot of politics involved in the whole topic of immigration.